Many people often say that a reserve currency country must run a deficit to maintain its status as the world's reserve currency. But is that really true? Does a reserve currency country need to avoid a surplus at all costs? Let's dive into this question as we explore the reasons why a reserve currency country can run a surplus and still be perfectly fine. Why do people think a reserve currency must run a deficit? For a long time, economists have argued that a reserve currency country like the United States must consistently run a deficit in order for its currency to remain relevant in the global economy. The reason behind this is that the US dollar is the world's key currency. If the US were to increase exports and run a trade surplus, global demand for the dollar could decrease, weakening its value and risking its position as the reserve currency. But is this really the case? Does a reserve currency country truly have to run a deficit to maintain its role in the global economy? Or can a surplus be just as acceptable? Thanks to voluntary demand, a surplus is fine. In reality, a reserve currency country can run a surplus and still be fine. The reason for this is voluntary demand. The US dollar is not just relevant to the US economy. It's used in global trade, financial transactions, and asset holdings. Therefore, there is ongoing demand for the US dollar from countries all over the world. Other nations need the US dollar for their economic activities and international trade, which creates a sustained demand. The role of the reserve currency. Because the United States is a reserve currency country, and there is voluntary demand for the dollar globally, the value of the US dollar remains stable regardless of whether the country is running a deficit or surplus. In other words, regardless of a deficit or surplus, the US dollar can continue to serve its role as the reserve currency. A comparison with Bitcoin. To make this concept clearer, think about Bitcoin. Bitcoin was initially distributed by Satoshi Nakamoto, but over time, voluntary demand developed. Now, Bitcoin isn't controlled by the original creator, but is driven by market demand and voluntary usage. Similarly, the US dollar continues to be the reserve currency because of its voluntary demand in the global market. The economic stability of the US does not rely on running a deficit. It's maintained by this consistent demand. Conclusion. Ultimately, the reason why a reserve currency country can run a surplus without an issue is because of voluntary demand. The US dollar plays a crucial role in the global economy, and the demand for it continues, regardless of whether the US is running a deficit or a surplus. So, whether the US runs a surplus or a deficit, it does not undermine its ability to maintain its role as the reserve currency.